Hi, my name is Lucy Huxley. I'm a whore, and welcome to my bedroom. Today, I'm not actually in my bedroom. I am in Toronto, and I am joined by Noelle Perdue. Noelle Perdue is a writer, producer, and porn historian with nearly 10 years of experience working platform side for multiple mainstream and independent adult industry companies. Having written everything from Food Network porn parodies to legally binding terms and conditions, much of her current work explores the blurry borders of obscenity and how pornography's history can influence our digital and political futures. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited.
So, you're a porn historian, which
Yes,
is a pretty uncommon job,
sure. It's sort of a job that I made up.
which is great. But what does that actually entail?
Great question. I mean, for me, I kind of come at it through the lens of looking at what's happening now and kind of the conversations that were happening about policy and technology and kind of mapping it back to how pornography could have influenced that kind of throughout the
Hmm.
last usually around 50 years. So a lot of my work is kind of looking at pornography's history, but also technology's history and how it connects to the adult industry.
Yeah, because it's all intertwined.
So much so.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And do you know other people who are also porn historians or like people who are doing kind of similar work to you?
I've never met anybody. I think that there are some people that are kind of in more academic environments with,
Hmm.
I guess, human sexuality and things like that. And there are definitely people who have covered kind of the history of pornography. So I'm not totally alone. I've never met them, but I'm sure it would be interesting if I did.
And how did you get into this line of work?
Well, I started in the adult industry as a scriptwriter.
Hmm.
And before that, I was working also as a writer for like sugar dating sites.
Okay.
And I was also doing a lot of like escort copy and things like that. So I was writing for the adult industry as a freelancer. And then I kind of started writing for the porn industry as a scriptwriter. And then I've kind of been working as a writer and producer ever since. And now I've been doing freelance for about 4 years.
Okay.
So that kind of piqued my interest in pornography, at least. And the
Hmm.
reason why I kind of went into pornography as a writing industry is because I love porn. And obviously, in working in the industry for so long, I learned a lot about it. And I'm also just generally like a history nerd. And I love to know the context behind things or why things happen the way that they do. So it kind of just so happened that I learned a lot about porn history and got really frustrated at how it doesn't seem to come up when we're talking about all these things that are so relevant to the history of
Mm.
porn.
Are there resources for porn history like difficult to find?
Very much so.
What are like the roadblocks you hit when trying to look for resources?
I feel like they're available, but they're not kind of respected. Like the resources for porn history aren't often coming from, academic institutions or these kind of larger, more, I guess, moneyed media companies. They're usually coming from forums or, individual people telling their stories or, the seedier news sites. But it's frustrating because it's such interesting information. It's such vital information that kind of gets pushed to the side.
And I guess I've also heard the term that we're in a digital dark age because things on the internet aren't being archived. Is that problem worse for porn, I would imagine, because it's less reflective?
100%. 100% it is. And that's something that I feel so stressed about because it's true. A lot of these other areas of history have formal archives in so many institutions, and pornography doesn't really get the respect that it deserves enough to have those, physical or protected digital archives the way that other areas of history does.
And speaking of history, the history repeats itself. We see
Mm.
cycles in politics, especially, and in lots of things. And you mentioned you see that in porn as well. What are the cycles that you see in porn history that you see repeating themselves?
Mm, that's a great question. I mean, I think that pornography as a an industry goes through kind of cycles the way that so many other industries do. I usually like to compare it to fashion because, in fashion we see the same things coming around every 10 or so years, 20 years. I'm not a fashion historian, I'm a porn historian. But I see the same thing happening with pornography, where even now it's so funny to hear people talk about something like OnlyFans, like it just sprung up out of nowhere and it's never been done before, when obviously so many subscription platforms existed before OnlyFans, and also really the first kind of independent way that people could subscribe to independent producers of porn on the internet was through subscription services. At the time, they were called membership sites, where people in the adult industry would have their own personal website that people would subscribe to on a monthly basis, and that would give them access to kind of an archive, a record of everything that they have produced and everything that they will produce, which is almost identical to OnlyFans. And similarly, I think that we're entering into this era where I'm seeing kind of post OnlyFans, I think that people kind of want to see higher production value from their pornography. People are interested in it being theatrical again and open to it being theatrical. And that's something where I think it's very interesting, because it is kind of harkening back to the 70s and 80s era of pornography, where it was very theatrical and it kind of existed in tandem with the mainstream movie industry, film industry. So I think that will be really interesting to see. But again, like, cycles like this just happen all the time.
The 70s and 80s were a really interesting,
I know.
interesting time
Highs
of
and
porn.
lows. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, most people don't know a lot about porn history,
Mm.
especially porn from that time. If they're younger, especially, what are some like defining features of porn from that time?
Oh my gosh. Well, I did a whole project. I did a lot of research on this because I'm also interested in genres of pornography beyond sex. What does genre look like in pornography when we take sex out of the equation? What are the visual languages of porn? And in the 70s and the 80s, there's a pretty distinct visual language. And back when AI was more interesting than it is now, I essentially trained an algorithm to spit out kind of new frames from kind of what the algorithm believed to be 1970s and 80s pornography. And something that I found really interesting from that is there was a really distinct visual language of kind of greens and browns, because in the 70s and 80s there was so much filming outdoors and so much Midwestern landscape, because at the time so many of these films would kind of be produced in the Midwest, as opposed to now where so many are produced or filmed, at least in California. But things like that. So, and very high production value. In the 70s and 80s, they would hire people to do original scores. That's something that is a dream. I would love for that to become normal again in the porn industry, for people to be hired to do original scores for films. I would cry.
It happens sometimes. I know Four Chambers has done it.
Yes,
Yeah.
Four Chambers has done it, and a few other of the independent studios and some of the really cool musicians have shown interest. So fingers crossed that it becomes more normal, because I really love when that happens. But yeah, high production value. There were like theatrical releases, obviously, and much larger casts, which is really nice. Definitely like longer scripts. As a scriptwriter, it's a dream. It's a dream. Although, not to say that there aren't feature length porn films that are released now, but it's certainly not as common as, shorter form content. But yeah, lots of things. But it's also tricky because, it's known as the golden era of pornography, but also obviously there was so much exploitation happening in that kind of age, and there weren't a lot of like workers' rights or protections for the performers. So if we could have, modern day workers' rights and protections with 1970s and 80s normalization of high production value, that would be
Yeah, those big budgets, big
that would be
sets.
amazing.
That would
Yeah,
be so
big
nice.
budgets. Oh,
Do you also, is there also a difference in like the type of sex that's happening in porn from that era as opposed to now? Because I feel like when people talk about mainstream porn, especially, they talk about how things are getting like more intense and more violent. That's a very kind of common thought to have, that porn
mm.
gets more intense in that way. Has that been your observation?
That has not been my observation. My observation is that pornography is so much more accessible now than it was in the 70s and the 80s, that people have access to a wider style of pornography, a wider range of the type of sex they can see in pornography, the way that it was harder to access in the 70s and the 80s. Whereas, kind of in that period, you would be able to access kind of like the most mainstream vanilla content available. Even then, there were studios and films that definitely pushed that. But now, obviously, if you have access to every style of pornography, you will be able to see kind of like the more intense or rough or etc. types of sex.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas back then, you kind of had to know where to look. You had to know who to ask to access that. And I think that's kind of a misconception that this is something that didn't exist back then, when absolutely BDSM porn existed in the 80s. Yes, it did. Maybe you couldn't find it, but it was definitely out there.
Yeah, either you couldn't find it or you weren't alive.
Yeah, or you weren't alive. Yeah, or you were sick. So I certainly hope you couldn't find it.
Yeah.
Whereas, yeah, it is a lot more accessible to find every style of porn you could possibly imagine now.
Yeah. But you would say the mainstream stuff hasn't changed, like the content of the sexual stuff hasn't changed in a big way, or
I mean, there are changes. I
mm-hmm.
think that the beauty standard in pornography has changed,
Mm-hmm.
I think for better and for worse. Obviously, it's known that body hair was so much more normal in the 70s and the 80s, the way that it kind of isn't in the most mainstream areas of pornography now. But also, I think that there are so many movements towards, kind of body positivity and body neutrality in pornography right now that are awesome. But the style of sex, I feel like it's so tricky because mainstream, it's so hard to define what exactly is mainstream now, because in particular we're in this like era of pornography where kind of individual performers and subscription sites and things like that are so popular that it's not just like one big studio that's kind of dominating or one style of pornography that's dominating. So it's hard to tell what exactly mainstream sex is in porn right now.
Yeah, because even like when you look on Pornhub, for example, on the front page, often a lot of the top videos are from like independent creators.
Yes.
They're not by studios or anything, like they're making their own content. And that kind of gets lumped in with mainstream, even though it's independent porn.
I agree. And I would say even there are so many things that I'm surprised really haven't changed since the 70s and the 80s. For example, I think that there are a lot of tropes that come from a place of racism and homophobia and things like that really kind of got locked in the 70s and the 80s that are still so popular today that I think is surprising that, that hasn't kind of moved in any direction.
I feel like porn has held on to a lot of those things, like the racism and the homophobia. Do you have a theory as to why that is still so strong in porn when we don't see it so much in other forms of media?
I think that pornography is a very brutally honest mirror. And I also think that it really reflects power. Pornography so often plays with power. So we do see, I think, kind of the ugliest elements of how power can play out in pornography, which again is something that I find comes up in a lot of criticisms of the porn industry, of being like, well, this is misogynistic or this is racist or this is homophobic. But it's frustrating to hear those arguments not because I don't agree, but because if that exists, it's because there's an audience for it. Pornography isn't creating things for nobody. Pornography isn't creating things without an audience demand. And so pornography for me is a reflection of what people are looking for, and sometimes like the uglier parts of, again, how power can play out within our society.
So back to like porn history in general, this obviously is not a topic that a lot of people talk about, the history of this industry. Why is it important? Why do you think it's important for people to discuss it and for people to have more knowledge about it? Like, how can it help both the audience and people in the industry?
Great question. I mean, I think that history is always important. And I do think that, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. I really believe that. And I think it's true for pornography. And I think that it's particularly important for pornography because of the ways that pornography can mirror these power dynamics that we find day to day in our society. And I also think that porn history is also the history of so many other things. Porn history is also technology history. Porn history is political history. Porn history is workers' rights history. And if we are kind of picking and choosing the areas of workers' rights history that we think is most palatable, we're not actually getting a good picture of that history. If we're picking and choosing the elements of technology's history that we think are most palatable, but we're leaving out some of the most important parts, we're actually left with an inaccurate picture of that. And we're not actually getting the education that we should have and that we need to kind of move forward in a productive way.
Yeah, I'm so often the adult industry and like sex work in general is cast aside from these discussions we have, like you said, about workers' rights and technology, but it's so integral
Yes.
to so many of those things. Like so many, maybe not so many, but quite a few technological and especially
So
internet
I would say
advancements.
so many. I would agree with
Yeah.
you. So many.
What are some examples?
I mean,
Like,
VHS, payment processing, subscription services like Netflix. You have the adult industry to thank for Netflix, everyone. All of these things are arguably digital image processing is pornographic, is porn history. Like all of these things that we use every single day, pornography was in some way involved or was a significant catalyst. Same with politics, where with so much legislation, especially the legislation that is getting headlined right now, so much of it was catalyzed because of the adult industry.
yeah.
And if we're not willing to actually teach that or acknowledge that, we're never going to have a deep enough understanding of these policies to kind of respond to them.
Yeah, it's quite frustrating because especially when it comes to politics and legislations, a lot of what is being discussed now, like sex workers have been trying to warn people about for years
Yes.
because we saw it coming years ago when laws started being passed against sex workers. We're like, this is going to affect everybody.
Yes.
And nobody listened because people
Yes.
don't listen to sex workers. And that's a massive thing for censorship as well,
Mm-hmm.
for online censorship. And now also like with the discussion of porn being banned in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And there's already laws in a lot of states about like age limits for porn and you have to upload ID and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really unfortunate that a lot of people just kind of cast that aside as, oh, that's just porn. Like that doesn't
Exactly.
affect me, but it actually can have wide-reaching effects that will
And it has.
affect
It
more
already
internet.
has. And I think that this is something that I try to talk to people about a lot is that it's not pornography law, it's obscenity law. And obscenity is such a famously difficult thing to pin down, and it's been used very effectively as an umbrella piece of legislation where anything that's labeled obscene can be criminalized. And if you think obscenity is going to stop at pornography, well, maybe you should read a history book because it doesn't. It comes for the queers, it comes for people of color, it comes for anybody that does not meet the white heterosexual cisgendered standard has been labeled obscene. Obscenity has been something that's been used to kind of cast aside anybody that doesn't fit that for so many years and effectively.
Mm-hmm. I know like obscenity law is a big thing in the United States. I know a bit about the history of it there. Does it have a similar history in like Canada and Europe or?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak so much to Europe,
Mm-hmm.
but Canada has a similar, I mean, unfortunately, Canada just is sort of very wrapped up in American politics. So while it doesn't have the exact same legislation, ultimately the legislation does end up affecting Canada and it also ends up affecting Europe because a lot of obscenity law legislation is kind of like internet legislation. And obviously, so much of what affects the internet is the legislation that's coming out of the States.
Like that's kind of
Yeah,
the global controller, like
exactly.
FOSTA SESTA, which was a series of bills that was passed in like 2017, 2018,
Yeah,
has had global effects on
exactly.
censorship. And yeah, it's just becoming more wide reaching. What are your concerns for that for the future with obscenity law and how it's going to affect things
I
on the
mean,
internet?
there's Project 2025,
Yeah.
which is terrifying, obviously, which for those listening is essentially an attempt to completely criminalize pornography. And a lot of the people that are kind of behind this project are, you know, former or current peers of Donald Trump. So while Trump himself has sort of publicly distanced himself from the project, it's very realistic to be concerned given how many people he's involved with are part of it. And I think that we are seeing just a push towards tighter legislation in particularly the United States, but as you said so succinctly, that does have global effects.
Yeah. What do you think a kind of general realistic outcome would happen from criminalizing porn in the United States? What would
Oh
be a
my
possible
gosh.
outcome of that happening? What would happen to the porn industry in general? Like,
Well, this is also the thing that I really want people to understand is that pornography is so hard to pin down. And that is something that these legislators know and take advantage of. So I would like just anybody listening to take a moment and hold in their mind how they define pornography. Because everybody has completely different definitions of pornography. And if you look into, some of these organizations that are looking to criminalize porn, I do recommend actually digging a little bit deeper because, for example, Exodus Cry, Swimsuit Illustrated to them was pornography.
wow.
So, it's not going to stop with Pornhub. These organizations think of pornography as, anything related to, I'm going to go ahead and say women having ownership of their bodies. If you can't have a bikini picture, if that's pornography, and that's the thing is that people don't understand that this is not just something that will only affect the adult industry because actually it never works that way. The adult industry is so effectively used as a scapegoat by particularly conservative politicians. It's used as this sort of vehicle for conservative political strategy because it is an industry and it's a group of people that is very easy to use as a boogeyman. But because the actual legislation, the way that this legislation is written, is so vague and it is actually obscenity law, it does end up affecting so many other people. And I really want people to understand that it's actually not just the adult industry, it's not just sex workers, it's coming for you. It really is. If you're not, the conservative, Christian, heterosexual, cisgendered, white standard, it's coming for you.
Yeah, even if you just post like sexy photos on Instagram, it's also gonna affect art that is seen as more
Absolutely.
respectable by society. It's gonna affect
Yes.
influencers.
And also, I mean, art is such a good point because so much of also the legislation that's written around pornography has explicitly affected art. And this has for as long as art and pornography has existed, this really blurry line between what is art and what is porn. And so often these kind of very famous cases of obscenity law coming into play, it is over something that is not kind of technically, porn, although again, that's so hard to define, but it's something that is for, French art films, things like that.
Yeah. Do you have a recent example of a case like that?
I mean, I have the most famous example, which is the Supreme Court justice. It's not recent, but the I Know It When I See It case.
Mm-hmm.
That was about a French art film that was shown at a gallery, and the gallerist was charged with obscenity and ended up taking it to the Supreme Court, who ruled in the gallerist's favor, famously because this is a paraphrase, but you know, I don't really know what porn is, but I know it when I see it. Which is, if you feel comfortable with that being the Supreme Court justice ruling of what pornography is I don't know. It, that doesn't make me feel
Yeah,
comfortable.
that's crazy. And what year was that in?
It was in the 60s, I believe, early 60s.
Okay, and there hasn't been like a ruling since then that
Oh no, there
has.
has been.
Okay.
I mean, cases like this do happen quite
Hmm.
often, like obscenity cases. That's just the most famous one. I mean, in Canada, there was famously, this wasn't ever a criminal charge, but it was an iconic moment in Canadian history where the Canadian government sort of accidentally funded a porn film and called Bubbles Galore.
I saw an Instagram post of yours about this.
Yes, yeah. So the Canadian government, through its arts granting system, funded this film called Bubbles Galore that was, absolutely a porn film. And it's iconic. It's so fun. I highly recommend anybody get their hands on it. But it was obviously hugely controversial and was used in kind of parliament to argue against arts funding in Canada for years and years.
So it also affected arts community at a
Mm,
greater scale, I
absolutely,
guess.
yes.
Wow.
But
And what year was
oh my gosh,
it? Or decade?
it was like early 2000s.
Okay.
But it's also something where it's like, it's so tricky because if you're gonna say that, arts funding shouldn't fund pornography, then again, we return to the question of, well, what is pornography then? Is it just nudity? So arts funding can't fund anything with nudity? That's a little bit ridiculous. Okay, well, arts funding can't fund anything that has sex in it. Okay, well, what about projects that are exploring human sexuality? Is that, every question has another question.
Yeah, and also how do you even define sex?
And exactly, how do you define sex? And also, so many of the most pornographic things online involve no sex at all. I would love for the government of Canada to fund my deep exploration into the foot fetish community. Sure.
Yeah.
I would love that. Is it porn? Yes.
Yeah, that's another thing that's so interesting is like how much fetish content there is, especially on platforms like TikTok and Instagram.
Oh my gosh, yes.
That is, it doesn't show any nudity, but it's porn because it's things like foot fetish stuff or like food fetish, like those big messy food videos that end up getting like millions of views.
About that
people
right now. Yes. Yeah,
yeah,
food stuff.
People in the comments are like, "Am I watching a fetish video?"
And
but it's also like entertaining.
Well, it's always if the thought in your mind, if it pops up, am I watching a fetish video? The answer is yes. If the question exists, the answer is yes, with 100% certainty. I saw it the other day, a horrific AI video of these women consuming massive vegetables. And it was so horrific because obviously this generative system can't fully render eating, so they're just swallowing. It turns into a wind in their mouth. It's so fucked up to watch, but it's totally fetish content. But this is also the thing of, sure, okay, no sex, but what about this?
Yeah,
pornography is one of the hardest things to define ever,
and I guess you can't really get rid of it in that sense.
Yes, because it's so malleable. It's constantly shifting.
Yeah, it'll just adapt to whatever's been placed on, and I guess it has adapted in the past. Yeah, and yeah, you mentioned the AI video. How do you see the porn industry adapting to AI? Do you have predictions on how that's gonna play out in the near future?
Yes, I mean things are getting weird. I'll say that. Things are getting really weird. I saw the other day an AI generated video of this woman, and she was, it's a generative system. This generated thing was pretending to be an orphaned villager in a war-torn village in Ukraine with her goats. And it was like very obviously an AI generated video, and that was being used to sell this woman's OnlyFans account. I know.
Whoa, okay.
I know. Sure. No, I know.
Because I haven't even thought of that, of like individual creators creating AI videos of themselves for promotion.
And this is the thing, is that to me, this situation really smelled like a management company, like a weird OnlyFans man. I'm like, I would bet money that this woman doesn't even know that this is happening, which is, an issue in and of itself. But yeah, so whoever made this very strange account used her real photos to train this algorithm to spit out videos where she is, on a farm with goats in what could maybe be the Ukraine. Which lots to unpack there, for sure.
Can you unpack it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we can unpack so many elements of it. Like the war-torn part is rough,
yeah,
for sure. But I also think that it's like trying to reach, obviously, a niche audience, which made me wonder. This was shown to me for whatever reason. That's something we could unpack.
Why is your algorithm showing you
for my therapist to unpack, frankly? But I am sure that there are so many iterations of this where, who knows what this, in all likelihood, management company has trained this algorithm to spit her out as, besides this villager. I wish I had more record or an understanding of who else she could be out there. But it is very odd. And clearly it's trying to reach a wider audience or a different audience, because this woman's actual OnlyFans account was a young luxury traveler account. Definitely not a war-torn villager at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that a really interesting strategy. Also because the videos are really I'm lonely and I'm looking for a boyfriend and please write me. I know. And which I think is really interesting because it also is like, well, okay, you have this, but then you follow the link and this is obviously not what's
Yeah.
happening. And I'm so curious what the success rate of that is, you know? So there's that happening. There are these very obviously fetish videos happening. There are like a dozen and a half companies trying to race to create perfect AI chatbot kind of thing, which obviously Replica has been doing for a while with its kind of girlfriend experience app. But that's really become popular. Like I think, are a lot of performers that are interested in kind of getting ahead of it and lending their kind of likeness and records to companies to train like an AI version of them, which
Hmm.
could be interesting. I think that could be an area where at least performers get something out of it.
Yeah, if you're
And
able to use it
it's
for yourself, I can imagine using an AI model myself to do a really weird custom video on OnlyFans so that I don't
exactly.
have to do it myself.
Yeah, exactly. Or, instead of having a generic chatbot answer people on OnlyFans, having a more personalized one that actually sounds like you. You know, there are applications where it makes sense, but I do think that there are a lot of other applications where it's stressful.
I think the possibilities are quite scary, and
Mm,
you know, the legislation and the laws around this stuff isn't ahead of the
no,
possibilities.
it's
It's not keeping up with it at all.
so wild. And it's also something where, with the possibility of kind of licensing your likeness, comes the reality of, in all likelihood, that likeness being used, without your consent and
Hmm.
without a licensing agreement, which is also really alarming.
Yeah, that's quite terrifying, and it can happen to anybody. It is
Anybody,
already
yes.
happening to people who don't work in the adult industry.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
I wanted to kind of circle back to porn history
Mm.
and sex education because, as we approach all these things, talking about AI and like porn bans and stuff, having media literacy around porn is really important. And talking more about porn and sex education in general is important. And like, what role would you like to see porn history have within sex education?
I mean, I feel like I would like porn history to be a part of all education,
Hmm.
Like, I think that it's definitely part of sex education, but it's also part of, you know, communications education, technology education, political education. But in terms of sex education, I do really think that it's important to start talking about pornography now, definitely, I think earlier than people are comfortable with at this point, because it is part of sex education, because porn, as we mentioned before, is so accessible. And it's also part of media literacy, because pornography just is a part of our media landscape. It's a huge part of our media landscape. And because it is being used so effectively as a vehicle for political strategy and conservative political strategy, that we really need to start having a better understanding of, the actual porn landscape, pornography as an industry, pornography as a cultural product, so that we can receive that kind of information, receive that propaganda with an educated point of view.
It's really a disservice to society that this massive part of media is just like cast aside and it's always something we don't talk about.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And it's also like, why? You know, why is this so uncomfortable? Particularly because we are starting to improve sex education, hopefully, generally, but pornography remains, you know, this really taboo subject even within that, which is so interesting because it's like, get real. You think people aren't watching porn? And it's a problem when people are watching porn without understanding it. And also, I think that it's so frustrating that so much of the responsibility of media education and media literacy education around pornography falls to the adult industry when that's actually not the case for any other form of media. And it should be a part
Mm,
of just, if you're teaching your kids about sex, you should teach your kids about pornography because they have access to it.
yeah. Yeah, that's a good point about how the education falls onto the porn industry because
Hmm.
that doesn't happen with any other form of entertainment.
No.
Even with the news, like news channels don't talk about propaganda and deciphering what news sources are best, but when it comes to the adult industry, we're expected to educate people
Yeah.
on porn literacy.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And also, I mean, I think that the adult industry has been very generous in how much it has sort of taken up that mantle, but it really shouldn't have to. I mean, I usually like to make the comparison of pornography is a lot like watching The Bachelor. If somebody watches The Bachelor and they think that's how dating works, that's a problem.
Yeah.
I think we can all agree that's a problem because The Bachelor is entertainment. It's a fantasy, it's fun to watch. And if somebody watches porn and they think that's what sex is and that's how I should conduct myself, that's a problem because it's entertainment and it's a fantasy just like The Bachelor.
Yeah, but society places the blame for that on porn. You hear
Exactly.
someone say, "Oh, I think dating is like The Bachelor." You're gonna be like, "That person's stupid."
Yes, that's a you problem.
Yeah, but then
Yes.
we talk about how people perceive porn that way. Like we talk all the time. That's such a big discussion about how people think that sex is like porn, but then we just blame porn
Yes,
for that.
exactly. And it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't.
Yeah. Like people think that sex is that way because sex education is so lacking.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
we have so few discussions about sex and so few other examples of sex besides porn. It kind of all.
Yes. Well, yeah,
falls onto that.
absolutely. Pornography and the porn industry has had to sort of fill, I mean, no pun intended, fill the hole. And, and it's not reasonable to expect it to do that when
Yeah.
actually this should be part of a wider institutional education system.
Yeah. What would you like to see fill the hole? Sex education, do you think it should be in public schools? I mean, of course, I think it should be as well. But yeah, how would you like that to
Definitely.
happen?
I think that proper sex education, wholesome sex education should be a mandatory part of curriculum, and porn literacy should be mandatory in curriculums. But not only for sex education, although it should be absolutely a huge part of sex education is porn literacy, but also just education around how the porn industry has affected so many elements of our lives, both politically and practically, should be taught in schools.
But yeah, porn is often used as a Trojan horse.
Yes.
What are like other important parts of porn literacy besides understanding that it's not real?
Huge. Yeah. I mean, I also think that I would love for people to have a better understanding of what goes into production, because I think a big misunderstanding of pornography and something that people don't get is kind of what happens before and after filming. So these extensive conversations around consent that happen often before performers are even in the room together, and then kind of conversations afterwards, all the things that need to be signed, the kind of release forms, et cetera, all of these things that aren't part of the sexy, well-lit whatever, but it's actually a huge part of it. And it's also a huge part of sex is these conversations around consent, making sure everybody's feeling good, checking in after, et cetera, that, those are elements that we don't really see in the final cut, but they are just as important as, the money shot.
Mm-hmm. Kind of linking to porn literacy, I've seen you talk a lot about the terms like deepfake porn and non-consensual pornography and why these terms are problematic and we shouldn't be using them.
Yeah, I can talk about that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I and so many other people in the industry are of the mind that pornography, much like sex, should inherently imply consent. So if somebody said, this person had non-consensual sex with me, that doesn't make any sense because sex implies consent. Otherwise, it's rape. And similarly, I don't believe in non-consensual pornography because when pornography is non-consensual for whatever reason, that's a crime. It becomes documentation of a crime or it becomes criminal material and it's not entertainment anymore. And pornography is an entertainment product and it should never be and is never non-consensual because at that point it becomes something else.
Yeah, we see that a lot also with sex work where people conflate. They talk about, people who are doing sex work non-consensually. And it's
That's not
that's
sex work.
exactly
That's human trafficking.
exactly
Yes.
sex trafficking.
Yes.
I feel like I say that so many times online, and it's so difficult for people to understand, which is really frustrating because I feel like we have gotten quite a good understanding of that when it comes to sex and rape. And it's frustrating that once you involve money,
Mm.
people can't wrap their heads around it.
Yes, absolutely.
But also with the term deep fake porn. So
I hate
what,
that term.
yeah, tell me about that.
I mean, what people are talking about when they talk about deep fake porn most often is it's somebody whose likeness has been used without their consent to, put their face on the body of usually a porn performer to make it look like they're the ones engaging in the sex act. So it's non-consensual. It's non-consensual for the person whose image is being used. And it's also, and I feel like this isn't talked about enough, it's also non-consensual for the porn performers whose images are being warped like that. And it's frustrating because that, again, is not pornography because it's non consensual content. And also, it sort of creates this understanding of deepfake porn as being inherently non consensual, when I think that there is room for consensual deepfake porn. But if we are using that label exclusively to refer to non consensual content, we're kind of erasing that from the possibility of existing.
I don't have a lot of, personally, I don't have a lot of hope that the term deep fake porn will fall out of use because I feel like, it's kind of fallen into use right with the rise
Mm.
of this like non-consensual material. Even like I think it was last year that those like AI images of Taylor Swift
Oh my gosh.
that was used, and that's just referred to as AI porn of Taylor Swift and like deep fake porn of Taylor
I
Swift.
know. I feel like it's such a shame because I do feel like it's going the same route of revenge porn,
Mm,
which is still so difficult to kind of remove from the conversation, where it's still the most easily accessed terminology for image-based sexual abuse material is revenge porn. And that is because it just became normalized. And I do feel like quote unquote deepfake porn is going in the same direction.
yeah, it's really unfortunate because language is like really
It's
important.
important. Yes, it's
It
important.
makes a big difference. And if we're lumping those things in together, we're calling them porn, then
Hmm.
yeah, we're not able to have that distinction that porn is consensual. If these
Yes,
other terms exist and we're using them that refer to non-consensual things.
absolutely. And I also think that it goes in the other direction where I don't think it's fair to the victims of image-based sexual abuse material or digital image-based sexual abuse material, because calling something that is, you know, criminal, that is assault, porn, is really unfair to the victims because it is sexualizing something that is violent. And
Yeah.
that's not appropriate for the porn industry. And it's also not appropriate for the victims of these crimes.
Yeah, it does a disservice to both, like when we
Exactly.
can't separate them and have actual separate
Yes.
conversations about them. Kind of more on the positive side of
Hmm.
things. What are you excited for about the future of porn? What are some positive things that you see happening or you see the potential to happen in the near future?
I think that people are caring more about porn than they arguably ever have. Consumers of porn are caring more about the industry, which I think is really exciting. People want to know about the industry. They want to know more about the people behind the porn they consume. And I think that's really exciting. And I think that's something that can take us really far, that just that curiosity, because I think that's kind of the first step to moving towards, proper porn media literacy, workers' rights, et cetera, et cetera. So I am really excited about that. And I also think that there are so many interesting things happening within the porn industry, so many people that are really fighting for movement, people doing really cool kind of experimental work, things that are really pushing the boundaries of, what is porn versus what is art and kind of proving that distinction is irrelevant. So I think that there are a lot of really cool things happening, and I am genuinely excited about the future of porn, even though, sometimes the things that I get shown on my Instagram algorithm that are made with AI are scary.
What would you recommend to people who are just maybe more of like an average consumer of porn who want to help things go more towards the positive direction in the future? What would you recommend them to do or change the way they consume about porn to kind of do what they can to make sure things don't go in a more negative direction in the future?
I think staying curious is really great. I think that being curious about the people behind the product, going out of your way to kind of find maybe if they have a Twitter or Blue Sky account, seeing kind of like how they interact with other people in the industry, listening to sex workers, listening to performers, listening to kind of producers, and following the people and listening to what they have to say about kind of what's happening in the porn industry right now is really important, and also will be the best way to actually learn about the porn industry is by listening to the people within it. So that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, that's good advice. I can back that.
Yeah.
Where can people follow you if they want to keep
Ooh.
up with you? What platforms are best?
I just made a Blue Sky, and I do have an X account. Both of those are Noelle Perdue _ I think. And then on Instagram, which is where I am most active, unfortunately, my Instagram is all_day_breakfast_. And I do post more stuff about porn on there.
Perfect. And I will link that in the show notes for everybody as well.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining me.
Of course, my pleasure.
My name is Lucy Huxley. I'm a whore, and thank you for joining us in my bedroom.